Japan's new political reality in East Asia is colliding head-on with Beijing's red lines over Taiwan, and the fallout is now reshaping already fragile China-Japan relations. Sanae Takaichi, who became Japan's first female prime minister in October 2025 and leads the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, has long been known as a conservative security hawk. Her rise came with an explicit promise to strengthen Japan's defences and tighten security ties with the United States at a time of growing concern over China's military activity around Taiwan and the East China Sea. Over the past week, those long-signalled instincts have crystallised into a direct clash with Beijing after a series of remarks in Japan's parliament about how Tokyo might respond if China uses force against Taiwan. The wording has triggered outrage in China, a formal travel warning against Japan, diplomatic protests on both sides, and a fresh debate at home over how far Japan should go in preparing for a Taiwan crisis. In an appearance before lawmakers earlier this month, Takaichi was pressed on how her government would interpret a possible Chinese attack on Taiwan under Japan's 2015 security laws, which allow limited use of force in collective self-defense scenarios. She has repeatedly framed a Taiwan crisis as potentially threatening Japan's own survival, given the proximity of Japan's southwest islands, sea lanes and US bases that would almost certainly be involved in any conflict. In that Diet session, she sharpened that argument. Sanae Takaichi said the so-called Taiwan contingency has become so serious that we have to anticipate the worst-case scenario. In separate comments reported by Japanese and international media, she also argued that an attack on Taiwan would be, in effect, an existential danger to Japan itself. Put simply, her position is that if China were to use force against Taiwan, Japan could classify the situation as a survival-threatening contingency under its security legislation, opening the door to deploying the self-defense forces in support. Roles, for example, protecting US assets or defending Japanese territory and sea lanes. That may sound like a technical legal interpretation, but in the context of East Asia's most sensitive flashpoint, it crossed a threshold. For decades, Japanese leaders have tried to keep their language on Taiwan deliberately vague, even as they quietly strengthened military planning with the United States. Takaichi's phrasing was seen in Beijing as a departure from that strategic ambiguity and as edging closer to openly linking Japan's security to Taiwan's fate. China regards Taiwan as part of its territory and insists that the Taiwan question is purely an internal matter. Its position is that any foreign government suggesting military involvement crosses a bright red line. Within days of Takaichi's remarks, Chinese foreign ministry officials publicly condemned them, describing the process statements as a serious interference in China's internal affairs and a violation of past political understandings between Beijing and Tokyo. At a regular press briefing, a ministry spokesperson delivered one of Beijing's strongest warnings to Japan in years. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian said China firmly opposes and will never tolerate this. According to the same briefing, Beijing has lodged serious démarches and protests and accused Japan of sending the wrong signal to pro-independence forces in Taiwan. China's defense establishment quickly joined in. A spokesperson for the Ministry of National Defense went further, warning that if Japan dared to take a risk on the Taiwan question, the country would face a crushing defeat. Party-linked media and nationalist commentators piled on, portraying Takaichi as a dangerous opportunist trying to shift Japan away from its post-war pacifism. The dispute quickly spilled beyond words. China issued a nationwide advisory urging its citizens to avoid travelling to Japan, citing what it described as rising hostility toward Chinese nationals and referring indirectly to the political row. The advisory prompted Chinese airlines and travel agencies to offer penalty-free cancellations or refunds on flights to Japan, in a move that could hit a tourism market still recovering from the pandemic and previous diplomatic disputes. In Tokyo, officials lodged a formal protest arguing that the travel warning was unjustified and risked inflaming public opinion in both countries. They reiterated that Japan's overall position remained unchanged. It formally recognizes Beijing as the sole legal government of China, but considers peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait essential for its own security and for the wider region. If Beijing's official statements were sharp, an outburst from a Chinese diplomat in Japan took the rhetoric to an even more personal level. On social media, China's Consul General in Osaka, Xue Jian, posted a message that appeared to threaten the Japanese leader directly, Shui. Jian wrote, "Cut off that dirty neck," in a now deleted comment widely understood to be aimed at Takaichi. The post sparked immediate condemnation in Japan across party lines. Government officials summoned the Chinese side to express strong regret, and politicians called for Shui to be declared persona non grata. The incident provided fresh ammunition to critics who argue Beijing is willing to use intimidation against foreign leaders who cross its red lines on Taiwan. China, for its part, has defended its broader response while quietly distancing itself from the consul's language by allowing the offending post to be removed. But state media continued to lambast Takaichi in harsh terms, with some outlets labelling her Japan's worst PM for destroying peaceful development of bilateral ties. Takaichi's remarks have not only rattled Beijing, they have also opened up significant debate inside Japan. Opposition parties and some veteran politicians warn that elevating a Taiwan contingency to a survival-threatening scenario risks locking Japan into a conflict it might otherwise avoid and could be used to justify a rapid expansion of military spending. From the centre-left, lawmakers such as Ichiro Ozawa have argued that talking loosely of an existence crisis may itself endanger the Japanese public by normalising the idea of war with a nuclear-armed neighbour. Former Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama has publicly urged the government not to interfere in what Beijing calls China's internal affairs, warning that such a shift would abandon decades of diplomatic restraint. Mizuho Fukushima, leader of the Social Democratic Party, has been particularly blunt, calling the idea that a Taiwan contingency automatically represents a survival-threatening situation for Japan completely illogical. A new national poll by Kyodo News suggests the public is sharply divided. Around half of respondents expressed support, or at least understanding, for the argument that Japan might be compelled to respond militarily if conflict erupts over Taiwan, while nearly as many voiced opposition or serious concern about that prospect. The numbers underline how sensitive the issue remains, even as Japan gradually increases defence spending toward a NATO-style benchmark of 2% of GDP. To understand why this particular set of remarks has hit such a nerve, it helps to look at how Japan's security posture has evolved. Over the past decade, successive governments in Tokyo, not only under Takaichi, have warned that China's rapid military build-up and assertive behaviour at sea pose growing risks to Japan's islands in the East China Sea, including the Senkaku-Diaoyu chain, and to shipping routes that run close to Taiwan. Japan's 2015 security laws, introduced under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, were designed to allow limited collective self-defense, particularly in scenarios where an ally such as the United States comes under attack and Japan itself faces an existential threat. At the time, officials were careful not to spell out in detail how those laws might apply to Taiwan. Takaichi has long belonged to the more hawkish wing of the ruling party. She has visited controversial war-related shrines, spoken warmly of Taiwan, and advocated higher defence budgets, arguing that Japan must be ready for worst-case scenarios in its neighbourhood. Her first weeks in office have been dominated by foreign policy tests, a trilateral agenda with Washington and regional partners, ongoing friction with North Korea over missile launches, and the question of how to deter China without tipping into open confrontation. Seen from Tokyo's perspective, her remarks on Taiwan were an attempt to clarify Japan's legal position and send a signal of deterrence, not a declaration of intent to fight alongside Taiwan's military. But the combination of her personal reputation, The explicit language about a survival-threatening situation and her past outreach to Taiwanese officials made it easy for Beijing to frame her stance as a deliberate provocation. For China's leadership, any hint that Japan might join or support military action over Taiwan inevitably carries historical baggage. The People's Republic of China regularly references Japan's occupation of parts of China and Taiwan before and during World War II and uses that memory to push back against what it sees as a revival of Japanese militarism. Officials in Beijing also worry about a tightening web of security ties among the United States, Japan, Australia, the Philippines and other partners in the region. They see talk of a coordinated response to a Taiwan crisis as part of a broader effort to contain China. Against that backdrop, Takaichi's comments arrived at a politically sensitive moment for China's leadership, which has been emphasizing national sovereignty and warning against foreign interference ahead of key political meetings. Strong rhetoric against Tokyo plays well with domestic audiences and reinforces Beijing's message that no country will be allowed to stand in the way of what it calls national reunification. In Taiwan, where President Lai Ching-te has welcomed closer ties with democratic partners, Takaichi's victory and early rhetoric have been broadly interpreted as a sign that Japan will take a tougher line on security issues in the region. Taiwanese officials have previously praised Takaichi as a longtime friend of the island. At the same time, Taipei is acutely aware that overt talk of Japanese military involvement could further inflame tensions with Beijing. Taiwanese leaders have generally avoided commenting directly on foreign leaders' phrasing, instead repeating that they seek closer practical cooperation while trying to maintain stability in the Taiwan Strait. In Washington, officials see Japan as a critical ally in any potential Taiwan contingency and have quietly welcomed Tokyo's moves to boost deterrence, but they also recognize the risks of rhetoric spiraling out of control. US diplomats have repeatedly urged all sides to avoid unilateral changes to the status quo and to keep communication channels open, a message equally directed at Beijing and Tokyo. China and Japan had only recently pledged to stabilize their relationship, with leaders meeting on the sidelines of regional summits and talking about constructive ties. Those diplomatic efforts now look precarious. Beijing's decision to issue a travel advisory, amplify nationalist criticism and warn of severe consequences if Japan meddles in the Taiwan Strait marks one of the sharpest downturns in relations in years. For Japan, the episode reinforces the sense that any public discussion of Taiwan is likely to provoke immediate and sometimes personal retaliation from China. Economically, both sides have strong incentives to keep the dispute from spiraling out of control. China remains Japan's largest trading partner, while Japanese investment and technology are important for parts of the Chinese economy. Tourism has been an important symbol of warmer ties in the past. A sustained drop in visitors from China could hurt local businesses in Japanese cities that depend on foreign tourists. Politically, however, the confrontation may harden attitudes on both sides. In Japan, attacks from Chinese state media and diplomats risk strengthening the arguments of those who favour a more robust military posture and closer alignment with other regional democracies. In China, Takaichi's comments are already being used as evidence that Japan is drifting away from its pacifist commitments and edging toward a more confrontational role in the region. For now, both governments are continuing their war of words while leaving room, at least in principle, for dialogue. Takaichi's administration insists that Japan's basic stance has not changed. It continues to uphold a one-China policy, does not support Taiwanese independence, and wants a peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. At the same time, it argues that Japan must be honest about the risks a Taiwan conflict would pose to its own security and prepare accordingly. Beijing, for its part, is unlikely to soften its public line. Officials have already labelled the remarks egregious and inconsistent with previous political commitments, and they continue to repeat that any attempt by Japan to intervene militarily in a Taiwan conflict would face resolute retaliation. Behind the scenes, diplomats on both sides and in Washington will be looking for ways to prevent this latest flare-up from triggering a deeper crisis. That might involve carefully worded statements that reaffirm past agreements, low-key meetings to keep communication channels open, or quiet assurances about the limits of any military planning. But the episode has already changed the political atmosphere. It has shown how a few sentences in Parliament, interpreted through the lens of long-standing mistrust and competing national narratives, can ripple outward into economic measures, social media threats, and public anger across borders. As regional tensions continue to simmer, the challenge for both Beijing and Tokyo will be to dial down the rhetoric without backing away from their core positions. Whether they can do that after this clash over Taiwan and over Japan's role in a potential crisis will go a long way toward determining the future of Sino-Japanese ties in an increasingly contested Asia-Pacific.